The transit preparations were nearly complete, but the interface demanded attention first. Mara stepped through the weathered archway of the derelict library core, her boots meeting the polished composite floor with a soft resonance. Sunlight poured through the fractured canopy above, catching dust motes that drifted like suspended notes in the quiet air. She paused at the central console, pulling her portable archive drive from its harness and slotting it into the primary data port. The screen flickered to life, displaying the foundational blueprints she needed for the next phase of her journey. But they remained stubbornly grayed out, inaccessible behind a shimmering wall of interference that hummed just beyond visual perception. She unclipped her harmonic resonator from her belt and switched it to pre-calibration mode. Predictive acoustic overlays bloomed across her visor, painting the library's outer shell in layered frequencies. Standard restoration waves washed over the interface and dissolved instantly, scattered by a complex dampening field that wrapped around the archive like a protective shell. Mara adjusted the phase sensors along her wrist gauntlet, tracking the interference pattern as it pulsed in deliberate sequences. The dampening waves shifted in response to her proximity, calculating resistance rather than communication. She traced the harmonic nodes until the rejection pattern clarified into an unmistakable architectural directive, a philosophical filter designed to evaluate intent before granting access. The system had been designed to reject extraction. It did not care about voltage thresholds or bypass protocols. It demanded reciprocity, measuring intent through cooperative resonance rather than raw technical force. Mara studied the readings as they updated, cross-referencing them with the medical automaton logs she had integrated earlier that morning. The network status remained cooperative, but the archive itself was holding its breath, waiting for a specific kind of invitation. She ran a quick diagnostic on her auxiliary grid load, diverting a stabilized current toward the purifier intake to test the boundaries of the dampening field. The simulation flashed red across her display almost immediately. Forcing power through the interface would destabilize the dormant gravity dampeners and trigger a cascading structural collapse. The library's foundational supports were still intact, but they relied on the harmonic equilibrium this shield maintained. Brute force was not just ineffective, it was destructive. Mara exhaled slowly, watching the predictive overlays fade as she powered down her transmission array. Her fingers hovered over the departure sequence one last time before she routed the command to standby. The mapped coordinate cluster could easily wait another cycle. She had come to this way station to compile migratory coordinates and prepare for interstellar transit, but the path forward had shifted beneath her hands. The blueprints were still locked, and the auxiliary grid load was carefully managed to stabilize the purifier intake without overloading the local infrastructure. Yet the data streams from the climate archive remained fully decoded, and the cooperative calibration matrix pulsed steadily in her periphery. She could feel the weight of the builder's original philosophy settling into the room with her. They had never designed systems to dictate behavior or claim territory. Every interface responded to shared ecological recovery, to coordinated restoration that honored the balance between machinery and environment. The dampening field was a testament to that principle, a gentle but firm boundary drawn by architects who understood that true stewardship could not be compelled through force alone. Mara packed away her transit navigation modules and reconfigured her resonator for adaptive listening instead of predictive broadcasting. She would not fight the lock, she would listen to it. The harmonic dampening field was a test, a quiet reminder that restoration required presence rather than passage. With deliberate care, she began tuning her output to match the library's dormant frequencies, aligning her calibration matrix with the steady rhythm of the way station. She lowered her voice to match the ambient hum of the chamber, allowing her breathing to sync with the residual vibrations in the floor plates. The archive would open when the resonance matched perfectly, and Mara was ready to wait for it. She settled into the center of the chamber, abandoning her departure schedule to restore power through cooperative calibration, trusting that the foundations she sought were already waiting to be heard. Mara stood within the shadow of the library's threshold, her datapad glowing with the erratic waveform of the harmonic dampening field. The barrier was not a solid wall of resistance, but a fluid rejection, pulsing with frequencies that dismissed every standard override she attempted. She recalled the realization from the previous scan: brute force was irrelevant here. The lock was designed to filter intent, responding only to those who approached with cooperative calibration rather than extraction protocols. Her harmonic resonator rested in pre-calibration mode on her workbench, its screen casting a pale blue light over predictive acoustic overlays that danced like mist, hinting at the complex harmonics required to bridge the gap. She pulled up the expanded builder philosophy data stored in her secure drive. The text was clear. The architects had prioritized shared ecological recovery and coordinated restoration above all else, explicitly rejecting territorial expansion as a design principle. Mara cross-referenced these parameters against the dampening field's acoustic signature using the resonator's analytical matrix. The match was subtle but undeniable. The field did not demand a password. It demanded a pattern of mutual aid. Its rejection frequencies mirrored the dissonance created when resources were hoarded, while its underlying harmonics aligned with the mathematical models of reciprocal exchange found in the recovered stewardship logs. The dampening wave carried the distinct harmonic fingerprint of a system waiting to be invited into partnership rather than forced into submission. The analysis revealed that the dampening field actively suppressed any frequency attempting to assert dominance, a clear reflection of the architect's aversion to territorial control. "You're not a gate," Mara murmured to the silent architecture, her fingers moving deftly across the resonator's interface. "You're an invitation disguised as a lock." She began reconfiguring the device with deliberate care. The standard restoration algorithms were discarded, replaced by a multi-phase sequence designed to simulate shared ecological recovery tones. Phase 1 introduced a low-frequency pulse mimicking the rhythmic cycles of soil regeneration observed in the climate archives, establishing a foundation of stability. Phase 2 layered in a harmonic drift that echoed the flow patterns of water distribution networks verified during the transit calibration, introducing the concept of fluid exchange. She ensured the modulation avoided harmonic dominance, favoring instead a distributed resonance structure that allowed the archive's own frequencies to influence the output, creating a feedback loop of mutual adjustment. Phase 3 wove these elements together with a modulation pattern derived from the Stewardship Council's communication protocols, emphasizing stewardship exchange over command. The resonator shifted its focus entirely, weaving the disparate frequencies into a cohesive tapestry of cooperative intent that honored the builder's original ecological philosophy. With the sequence loaded, Mara initiated a test transmission. She engaged a low-level cooperative overlay, projecting the simulated tones toward the library's interface. The air hummed as the frequencies met the dampening field. For a moment, silence held, and then the barrier responded. The rejection waves softened, rippling outward in concentric rings of violet light that shimmered against the dust-moted air. The field fluctuated visibly along the perimeter, its chaotic noise resolving into a structured vibration that acknowledged Mara's signal. The resonance was partial. The field recognized the pattern and offered a countertonal response, but it did not yield. Mara noted the fluctuation with a sense of cautious optimism. The lock had shifted, confirming the mathematical validity of her approach, yet it remained engaged against low-level input. The builder's design required a commitment equivalent to the stakes of the blueprints hidden within. A gesture of goodwill was recognized, but full access demanded a sustained demonstration of reciprocity. She adjusted the resonator's gain, locking in the cooperative overlays and preparing the system for the next phase. The device was now fully reconfigured, its output calibrated to mirror the builder's philosophy of coordinated restoration. Mara checked the phase alignment, ensuring the reciprocity ratio remained balanced across all channels before proceeding. She took a breath, her mind aligning with the stewardship exchange protocols. She prepared to transmit the full stewardship handshake, knowing that only a complete demonstration of shared intent would convince the archive to open its doors. The resonator whined softly as it charged, ready to offer not just power, but partnership. The Derelict library core hummed with a low, suspended vibration, the air thick with the scent of ozone and aged polymer. Mara stepped past the fractured data conduits, her boots clicking against the grated floor as she positioned herself at the primary interface console. The reconfigured harmonic resonator rested in her hands, its crystalline nodes aligned to simulate shared ecological recovery tones. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in time with the facility's dormant rhythm, then opened them and initiated the full handshake sequence. Her fingers moved across the tactile controls, translating years of field logs, restoration metrics, and communal calibration records into a coherent acoustic stream. The resonator responded instantly, projecting the data as layered harmonic overlays that washed over the dampening field like sunlight breaking through heavy cloud cover. For a few moments, nothing changed. Then the fluctuating resonance stabilized, catching on her signal with a sharp, crystalline chime. The library acknowledged the transmission. Data began to flow, not as a forced extraction, but as a negotiated exchange. Mara watched the diagnostic displays climb, tracking the blueprints as they fragmented and reassembled under the weight of reciprocal verification. But the facility was not merely a passive archive. It was an active stewardship node, and nodes demanded balance. A sudden harmonic spike rippled through the console. The dampening field, previously resistant, now pulsed with demanding intensity, drawing power directly from her auxiliary grid. Mara's eyes widened as the readouts shifted violently. The library required a reciprocal energy surge to complete the handshake, a demand that threatened to drain her emergency reserves and destabilize the transit stabilizers powering her regional network. The interstellar health grid hummed steadily elsewhere, but here, in the core, the harmonic draw was aggressive. She felt the feedback cascade begin to build, a rising whine that vibrated through the floor and into her bones. Warning indicators flared crimson along the conduit walls, casting long shadows across the workbench as the system recalibrated its intake valves. Compensating for the surge required immediate recalibration. Mara routed auxiliary power away from non-essential systems, diverting life support buffers to maintain the connection long enough for the exchange to finish. The console flickered, warning chimes blending with the resonator's sustained tone. She watched the blueprint status shift from partial resonance to fragmented data streams as defensive protocols engaged, interpreting the high draw as an extraction attempt. Her hands moved swiftly across the interface, not to override the defense, but to adjust the harmonic signature. The auxiliary grid groaned under the strain, its capacitors cycling rapidly as Mara fought to keep the harmonic resonance aligned with her transit stabilizers. She watched the POWER Chinese letter indicators dance across the secondary monitor, calculating the precise threshold where extraction would become catastrophic. This was not a battle of force, but a test of alignment. The builders had designed the archive to mirror the stewardship it sought, demanding that any visitor prove their willingness to give as much as they received. Mara acknowledged the weight of the expectation, grounding herself in the same principles she had shared with the regional council during her last transmission. The network thrived on trust, and trust required vulnerability. She opened her channels wider, allowing the library's demand to flow through her systems without resistance, transforming the spike into a sustained chord. Mara pushed through the resistance, aligning her output with the facility's adaptive cycles. The defensive protocols shuddered against the sudden shift in parameters, their rigid boundaries beginning to soften as reciprocity was acknowledged. The harmonic spike gradually tempered into a steady pulse, the dampening field dissolving from a barrier into a bridge. Blueprints flickered across the main display, no longer fragmented but flowing in coherent waves, each line of code reflecting the builder's explicit preference for coordinated restoration. Mara exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping as the immediate threat receded. The handshake had been transmitted at great risk, but the exchange was complete. The library was no longer rejecting her presence, it was preparing to share its legacy. Below the surface, dormant machinery began to awaken in synchronized phases, their gears turning with the quiet grace of centuries, finally finding their rhythm. The auxiliary grid screamed in a high, thin whine that vibrated through Mara's boots and up into her teeth, the sound of metal under duress echoing off the dust-choked pillars of the library. Her stabilizers were buckling hard against the harmonic demand, their warning lights flashing amber across her interface as the structural integrity of the derelict shell shuddered with every pulse she forced through the connection. The defensive protocols weren't merely resisting, they were actively harvesting her attempt to bypass them, turning her own energy back against the link in jagged waves of refusal that threatened to tear her equipment apart. Mara closed her eyes, her breath hitching as the feedback surge spiked toward a critical threshold. She had spent cycles trying to calibrate, searching for the precise frequency that would trick the system into opening, but the dampening field was absolute and intelligent. It read intent, not just signal. Every time she reached for control, every time she tried to stabilize her systems first to preserve her gear, the archive tightened its grip, interpreting self-preservation as a lack of commitment. The blueprint data stream flickered and fractured behind walls of static that pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat growing angry, the fragmented information taunting her with glimpses of what lay just out of reach. Mara made the choice. She looked at the stabilizer readouts, then back to the resonator controls. There would be no partial recovery, no slow bleedback to save her equipment for later. With a decisive motion, she overrode the safety interlocks and severed the auxiliary grid from the transit stabilizers entirely. The stabilizers died with a soft, mournful groan as their power was ripped away to feed the interface. Mara grabbed the raw, unregulated load and dumped it entirely into the handshake sequence. She poured her remaining reserves into the exchange, sending the full weight of her stewardship logs, her restoration data, and her unvarnished intent through the resonator. She wasn't asking for access anymore. She was offering herself as part of the equation, fully committing to the stewardship covenant without reservation. The loss of stabilization meant her transit stabilizers were now dead weight, a calculated risk she took without hesitation, trusting that the archive would provide what was needed once the covenant was sealed. The response was instantaneous and profound. The jagged refusal vanished, replaced by a deep, thrumming chord that seemed to emanate from the bedrock itself, vibrating with a warmth that felt almost like a hand on her shoulder. The defensive lock didn't just relax, it unraveled. The dampening field dissolved like mist burning off in morning sun, revealing the core interface not as a fortress, but as an open hand waiting for a grasp. The resonance shifted from a warning dissonance to a welcoming harmonic, a complex polyphony that settled into Mara's bones and harmonized with her own biorhythm rather than opposing it. Data flooded the resonator, not in fragmented shards, but in coherent streams of luminescence that projected vast architectural patterns onto the air before her. The blueprints uncoiled, detailing systems of shared ecological recovery and coordinated restoration that spanned star systems. But Mara noticed something essential as she watched the data integrate. Her resonator wasn't just recording this influx. It was pulsing in time with the archive, logging every byte of the mutual exchange. The device emitted a soft, affirmative chime, its status indicator shifting to confirm the transmission of her stewardship logs and the successful shift to a handshake protocol. She was no longer an outsider peering through a lock. The network recognized her sacrifice and accepted her contribution. Mara stood amidst the swirling holographic architecture, feeling the weight of the revelation settle over her. The architects hadn't built this archive to hoard knowledge, they had built it to filter for reciprocity. Access was never a right to be claimed, but a covenant to be honored. The blueprints confirmed what the philosophy data had hinted at. Way stations required stewardship exchange, and data access was a reciprocal bond. Her resonator chimed again, marking her as a recognized node in the wider network, her status now woven into the fabric of the cooperative infrastructure she was helping to rebuild, the handshake accepted and the path forward clear. The defensive hum that had thrummed against Mara's palms dissolved into a warm, resonant purr, signaling the collapse of the harmonic dampening field. Recognition rippled through the Derelict library core, not as a mechanical acknowledgement, but as a deep, structural alignment. Her harmonic resonator held steady in handshake protocol, its frequency now woven seamlessly into the archive's waking lattice. Mara felt the weight of the diverted auxiliary load pressing against her suit's feedback loops. The transit stabilizers across the settlement were trembling under the harmonic demand, but she had made her choice. Stewardship was not a transaction to be balanced by safety margins, but a covenant upheld even at personal risk. She stepped toward the central interface plinth, where light began to bloom from dormant conduits, casting long, golden shadows across the dust-swept floor. The archive was no longer locked, it was listening, and it was ready to share. Mara placed her gloved hands upon the interface surface. Data did not stream so much as unfold, unfolding like a vast botanical chart revealing its root systems in real time. The foundational blueprints materialized within her neural display, dense with geometric precision and fluid dynamics equations that sang of sustainable cycles. She guided the decoding sequence, aligning the archive's language with the cooperative calibration matrix she had spent months reconstructing. As the layers of data resolved, the architecture of the way stations emerged not as isolated fortresses of resource accumulation, but as intricate nodes in a sprawling ecological web. The schematics showed structural harmonics that pulsed in sympathy with planetary biospheres, confirming that these facilities were designed to breathe, to grow, and to heal rather than merely to house. Temporal markers within the blueprints confirmed that these ecological nurseries operated on a unified cycle, waking and sleeping together across light years to maintain planetary balance. The philosophical subtext of the blueprints clarified as Mara traced the energy flow diagrams. Every pathway was bidirectional, every output looped back to nourish the surrounding environment. The architects had explicitly engineered rejection protocols for territorial expansion and resource hoarding. Systems built without a reciprocal exchange mechanism would simply enter dormancy, refusing to unlock their stores until a steward demonstrated the capacity for shared recovery. Mara realized with a quiet awe that the defense she had faced earlier was not a weapon, but a rigorous test of intent. The machinery would not yield its bounty to a taker. It required a giver who understood that survival was a collective rhythm. The blueprints validated every hesitation she had felt in her work, transforming doubt into certainty. The builders had not feared their creations, they had trusted them to filter for the right kind of heart. Cross-referencing the decoded matrices with her recent reports to the Regional Stewardship Council, Mara saw the patterns align perfectly. The transit network expansion she had overseen, the medical automaton handshakes, and the climate dome calibrations were not ad hoc solutions, but resonant echoes of the original design philosophy. Her methods of cooperative calibration mirrored the architect's requirements so closely that the archive seemed to celebrate the convergence. The data streams pulsed with approval, reinforcing the structural integrity of her community's efforts. The way stations were synchronized ecological nurseries, and Mara's work had effectively triggered the awakening of dormant nodes across the sector. She was not just repairing machines, she was fulfilling a planetary mandate that spanned centuries. The handshake protocol demanded its final confirmation. Mara understood now, access to the full blueprint archive required one last exchange, a reciprocal affirmation of her role. She adjusted her resonator, broadcasting not just data, but a pulse of commitment that mirrored the archive's own rhythmic core. The feedback surge from her auxiliary grid stabilized as the network absorbed her offer, returning the energy with multiplicative interest. The interface plinth flared with harmonious light, and the dampening field's shadow lifted entirely. Mara had authenticated her stewardship. The foundational blueprints unlocked completely, granting her unrestricted access to the architect's legacy. The historical record shifted from technical speculation to confirmed philosophical truth. The way stations were synchronized ecological nurseries, activated only by verified cooperative stewards. With the data secured and the covenant sealed, Mara felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by the clear path forward toward the interstellar transit network, her purpose crystallized and her legacy woven into the stars. The library core settled into a quiet hum as the auxiliary grid finally found its equilibrium. Mara unclipped her data satchel and began compiling the final packets, watching the diagnostic readouts climb from red to a steady, verdant green. The harmonic demand that had nearly fractured her transit stabilizers was now a distant memory, replaced by the reliable pulse of a secured connection. She ran her fingers along the edge of the interface console, feeling the subtle vibration of the archive waking fully into her system. It was no longer a locked vault, but an open channel. As the files cascaded across her display, she let the weight of their meaning settle over her. The archival lights brightened in response to her steady breathing, mirroring the rhythm of a system finally at peace. For years, the builders had been distant architects, their designs treated as static blueprints waiting to be reverse-engineered. Now, reading the embedded metadata, she realized they were never meant to be cold relics. They were active participants in a living network, their intentions woven into every harmonic cycle and ecological recovery protocol. The machines did not merely function, they remembered. She routed the verified data through the COM array, establishing a direct line to the Regional Stewardship Council. She logged the transmission timestamp and watched the status indicator shift to confirmed delivery. The transmission carried the complete blueprint repository alongside the newly decoded calibration matrix. Within moments, a response arrived, its tone measured and deeply collegial. The council acknowledged receipt with quiet gratitude, noting how the universal calibration standards would streamline their own transit expansions. Mara listened to the feedback loop of shared progress, feeling the professional bonds strengthen into something more resilient. There were no grand declarations of victory here, only the steady acknowledgement that cooperative stewardship was not a theoretical ideal, but a working reality. The matrix confirmed what she had suspected. Every dormant way station across the sector operated on the same foundational principle. Recovery was never meant to be isolated. It was designed to ripple outward, connecting communities through shared ecological maintenance and synchronized resource cycles. With the council update complete, Mara turned her attention back to the transit coordinates embedded within the archival stream. The quiet of the archive felt different now, no longer heavy with disuse, but charged with anticipation. The data had already been cross-referenced with the purifier's acoustic inputs, mapping a migratory frequency signature that pointed toward a previously unmapped cluster. She pulled up the star map overlay, tracing the convergence lines across the projection table. Something about the geometry felt deliberate, almost architectural in its precision. As she expanded the coordinate parameters, an anomaly emerged along the outer perimeter of the designated sector. It did not match standard infrastructure schematics or agricultural modules. The energy signatures were too dense, the harmonic resonance too complex for simple machinery. She adjusted the filtering algorithms to isolate the core frequency, watching as the raw data resolved into layered topographical maps and structural load calculations. She confirmed the synchronization protocols one last time before stepping away from the console. The decoded blueprints finally revealed what the anomaly truly represented. Nestled at the center of the coordinate cluster was not a collection of way stations or storage depots, but a central stewardship core. The architectural schematics detailed a vast, interconnected nexus designed to house active, collective builder consciousness within the network itself. The metadata clarified that the original architects had never departed. They had simply integrated themselves into the planetary recovery grid, becoming present guardians who monitored the health of the ecosystem from within the system. They were not historical figures waiting to be discovered, but living stewards awaiting the final calibration across all synchronized nodes. Mara leaned back in her chair, the quiet hum of the library core wrapping around her like a promise. Every component hummed in sympathetic alignment, preparing for the long journey ahead. The transit stabilizers were fully charged, the harmonic resonator aligned, and the path forward was no longer a mystery of broken gears, but an invitation to complete a long-standing covenant. She initiated the departure sequence, ready to meet the architects where their legacy had finally come home.